We know nature is complex, yet how do we manage such complexity? We can see such complexity just in these images, and that there's so much complexity that goes beyond the scope of these images. But the idea is to capture how we think about things. So let's just even look at the iceberg. We see that iceberg above the surface and look at what is going on underneath. So much more. How do we look at our land that way? Are we looking at what's going underneath or just at the surface? The bison, they were keepers of the land, if you will. The predator prey action kept the land healthy by their movement. Do we take any of these things into consideration as we're working on the land? And should we? So what I want to do is show a few examples of things to get us thinking about the complexity and how we manage it. So just a quick example of the soil. Some monoculture soil, very, very compact versus forest, very rich by everything breaks down very easily. We know in that monoculture things aren't breaking down, but also the nutrients. As stated by the World Economic Forum, a teaspoon of soil contains up to 6 billion microorganisms. Are those microorganisms effectively working in that monoculture soil or not? And how can we make our soil healthier so that we are looking at things in a complex way and still being effective with our own life? And I'll come back to that. Another example, and this we'll talk a little bit about ecosystem processes. In these pictures, we can see great things happening. On both of these, on the left side is holistically managed land, on the right, conventional agriculture. Interestingly enough, here comes a storm. Literally down that fence line, it's the rain is coming. Is that coincidental or not? Again, complexity. How are we managing it? How are we looking at things? On the other image on the left, the water is sitting there. That water cycle is not very effective. Yet on the holistically managed side, it is. We don't see that water sitting there. It's actually getting into the soil. So how are we managing all these things? Another example, the temperature on the ground. So in this example from Chatham, New York, the air temperature is 93 degrees. The If there's tall pasture grass, the temperature there was 83 degrees. And overgrazed pasture, short grass, there's still grass, but it's short, 108 degrees. So again, in that tall pasture grass, 10 degrees cooler and then much hotter in a pasture that's got grass. And then we look at bare soil, much more hot, 115 degrees. And then we've got the temperatures there of mulch, veggie beds, and black plastic, much hotter. But the point is, how are we looking at these things? And are they important? What's happening to the nutrients if the temperature is 115 degrees? A lot of folks might pull weeds, but then you end up with bare ground. Is that being effective, or is there a different way to do it? Mm. And then not only the ecological processes, but what about the social and financial aspects? Are we looking at these things? I was introduced to holistic management at a National Bison Association conference, and for once, everything made sense when they talked about holistically planning things because we have this complex nature and everything about us is complex. It was a system that put things into plain view that made sense that we could manage effectively. And so I actually started learning with HMI, Holistic Management International, and then lately with Savory Institute. And there's a framework so that we can manage the complexity. And they talk about four key insights. I mentioned the predator-prey effect with bison earlier, and they were the ones keeper of the land. But also, as we talk about holistic, everything functions in whole. So one thing affects another. And are we looking at those kind of things? And the environment, brittleness scale is one of the key insights. What we have here in the West is completely different than the East Coast. There is a lot of humidity and things break down. Here, things are dry. So using an animal whose gut will process that material helps in some ways replicate that humidity in an environment like the East Coast that we don't have in the Western states. And then timing, instead of number of animals, that affects overgrazing of the land. I gave some pictures that showed the water cycle, but also some of the other cycles, the ecosystem processes. We take that into account when we're looking at things in a holistic manner. So we could easily walk out onto anybody's farm or ranch and look at those processes and see, are they being effective or not? And the bottom line of all of this is what Savory calls your holistic context. It's the first three boxes of the framework, which is illustrated in the picture. I'm not going to go through all that in detail because there's a lot to comprehend. They have courses on all of this. But that holistic context takes into account your values, what it is you want, not just for the land, but you, and why are you interested in taking care of the land? But are you also making the money you want? What if I told you that most people in holistic management are making more money as a result because they're looking at their lives as part of the holistic framework and setting their goals and their values as the very first thing? Um, and I'll come to that with the Mother Cabrini Shrine where I'm working, what those holistic goals were for us. But first, just some quick snapshots of the effect that holistic land management has made. This is in 3 years in Zimbabwe. What an impact that made by by taking on these processes. As our keynote speaker spoke about, huge effect for him. And as he stated, had they continued the way they were doing it, they would have wound up either broke or selling their ranch. But they turned things around, and most people with holistic management have been able to do that successfully. So again, how did I get involved in this, and how is it tied to the Mother Cabrini Shrine? As I mentioned, I learned about holistic management and then began taking classes through HMI and then Savory, learning about this because it made sense to me and I wanted to know more about it. In the midst of me taking classes, 10 minutes from my house is a place called Mother Cabrini Shrine in the foothills of Denver, in Golden, Colorado. And you can see Denver here in the foreground in the one sub picture. And they have 400 acres of agricultural land that surrounds their religious property where thousands of visitors come every year. And on that agricultural land, they have elk that frequent the land often, sometimes 200 at a time. And they were concerned about the elk overgrazing the land. So in 2021, when I started this work with them, I said, hey, there's another way that I'm learning about, and I would love to see if we could, input those practices onto the land and make a difference. And at first, their response to me was, Pam, that's pretty counterintuitive that what you're talking about. Lo and behold, a week later, the caretaker of the land, his cousin came into town who happened to be a cattle rancher in Oregon, and he said, yep, this is the only way to do it. So shortly after that, I'll come back to this slide, I gave them a presentation on holistic management, showed them this picture, and said, I do believe we can make a difference. And when they saw this picture, along with those other pictures I showed you, they were like, okay, let's go ahead and see what we can do. Again, their approach was to rest the land for a couple of years. Resting the land is a tool, but so is animal impact. And that was the tool that I really wanted to bring to the table, along with all the other parts of the holistic management framework. But resting the land in a brittle environment can be a challenge, or it doesn't actually, not a challenge, it's a challenge because it doesn't really work very effectively. What happens when we rest land here in a brittle environment, a dry climate, if you will, where things don't decompose naturally, the land becomes more and more compact. And so, similar to some of those images I showed you earlier, the water is not getting into the ground. And so by using the animals, we're breaking up that land, that soil, so moisture can get in. That's definitely the first layer, but plus we're adding those nutrients then into the land. And then if we manage it, which is the key, managing it properly, we can then really enhance the land. So, as I said, we embarked in 2021 on this project. I did not know much about agriculture, I will be honest and say, but again, holistic management made so much sense to me. And I was like, okay, we can do this. And so looking at doing planned grazing was, again, our main tool instead of what they thought of resting the land. And so using tools like Google Earth, I laid out 20-acre pastures on our 400 acres. This surrounds the religious area where thousands of visitors come every year. And what we have a dirt road that comes up from the religious area, provides access to the agriculture land, and we have water tanks that are right there where we enter the agricultural land. There's been a fence that splits the east and the west property. So, and we have perimeter fence. They've always been in place because this land has been grazed for a number of years. Initially, when Mother Cabrini herself acquired this land in the 1900s, they actually farmed the land. And then at some point, they transitioned to haying the land. And then now they lease it to cattle ranchers in nearby. And so again, the cattle would just graze the 200 acres either on the east side or 200 acres on the west side. And so again, what we wanted to do was to break up the land so that we could rotate the cattle effectively and manage them accordingly. We started with some low-hanging fruit where we already had 3 perimeter fences here, and we built a fence line to create our pasture. 1,000 foot. We also decided we would build alleys so that we had access to the water. So as we added pastures, they'd always have access to the water tanks. So the first year we quickly built this. That was great. And then we continued on. I'm going to talk a little bit about our fencing in a few minutes. But if you can see in these pictures, we started with our west pasture one, our second pasture on the west, and then we built our third pasture. We actually, as we rotated the cattle, we were able to build this pasture. So we had those 3 built in the first year. And then the second year, we really focused on the east side building this pasture. We actually have a spring that runs 24/7 every day of the year. And so working with NRCS, which we wanted to provide some controlled access into that spring area to revitalize some of the land that had been eroding from the animals, both the cattle and the elk for sure. We did work with NRCS. That was a huge help for me to get started. They have been a tremendous asset, and this is the map that they had put together initially. So again, we were looking at different things, and I'll show you where we are today and where we'll be heading. Notice though, we have this area here in the trees, and I should say, so NRCS, we've been very fortunate. One of the goals in doing this was one, keep the land beautiful, have enough forage for the cattle, plus wildlife, work with the wildlife instead of against them. And then one of my personal goals with this was not to incur any other expenses for the shrine. This maintaining the agricultural land obviously is a priority, but not in terms of all the other things they have going on in the main religious area. So I wanted to be able to do this where, again, we didn't add any additional expenses. So luckily, through NRCS, we were able to get an equip contract. We get reimbursed for the fencing through that, plus some of the controlled access that I just mentioned with the spring. When we planned this, I did not realize how much the cattle would graze in the trees, and they do. So when we had a workshop, and I'll mention that we do offer workshops, that was another goal actually, on the land was for working on the land, they have retreat facilities, was to hold the holistic management workshops on the property twice a year plus. And one of our attendees last year was actually involved with allocating the Climate Smart grant. And she noticed that we weren't using the trees in our planning. And so in discussion, we realized that through silvopasturing, we can actually get funding through the Climate Smart Grant. So this year, we're actually getting the EQIP contract. It's our third year. It'll be our last year of that contract, and then the Climate Smart Grant as well. So they're both, that's in process. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the fencing. So that's kind of what it looked like when we started to plan things. This area, so all of this property has exterior fencing and then fencing between the religious area and the agriculture area. This is actually the road up. It's a mile road up to the main part of the property from the highway, if you will. This land does not have fencing all the way around. So I'm actually hoping that we can do some virtual fencing on that land. Hopefully we can get a grant or do a demo site with virtual fencing on this land. We also have very steep terrain, as you'll see in some of the photos going forward. This is where we are. This past summer, we were able to build our fourth pasture on the west side. So we've got those built out. The east is in pretty good shape this pasture, but we've also extended this fence line all the way to the east. And then we're going to create another two pastures down here. We're going to split this in half and the same over here. And then we're going to split the trees along here for logistics. And then we'll have a total of 11 pastures, which is going to really work well for our rotational grazing. So when we talked about the grazing, planned grazing versus rotational grazing, we often use the term rotational grazing, and I believe there is a big difference. It's one of the things I learned. When we're talking about planned grazing, we're actually planning for recovery. So in some of these pastures, I might have, and not only recovery, but also how much time, how much forage is left in each pasture as I proceed. So in pasture 3, I might put the cattle in there for 6 days, but I go out there and they've already done quite a bit of eating on that grass, and I don't want them to overgraze. So I might shorten it to 4 days. And so in a planning chart, which I know many of you are probably familiar with, we would adjust that. The planning chart has a lot of details. It's actually very easy. But we want to continuously observe, monitor, and modify. And then going back to the recovery, we're actually working backwards because we want to know how much time in each of these pastures it takes for the grass to recover, different than rest. But sometimes in the fast growing season, it takes 30 days for it to recover. In slow growing season, it might take 60 or 90 or 120 days or longer. And so we plan for that, rotate based on that in our initial plan, and then we adjust. So I mentioned fencing. So as I showed you in the diagrams, a lot of this is based on fencing, interior fencing. Initially, I thought temporary fencing would be the way to go in case we wanted to change things. We don't have huge resources. It's mainly been myself and the caretaker of the property who heads up all of the maintenance, who's actually worked on the property for about 50 years, actually grew up there as well. And it's mainly been him and I. We have gotten some help, especially this past year, and I'll talk more about that towards the end. But we began fencing with polywire and step-in posts. We thought this was great, wildlife friendly. Well, those elk keep showing up, and if you can see on that bottom line, they just knock it out. So we kept repairing. So then we decided to go to smooth wire and more permanent fixtures on the end to hold it in place, more T-posts and things of that nature. So we began modifying things. Here's our posts that we were installing in cement at the ends, in the middle, wherever we had a big change. We have very steep terrain, so that also adds a complexity. But this was been very successful. With the NRCS EQIP contract, it turns out that if we did more permanent fencing, we would actually get reimbursed more funding. So I kind of wish I knew that in the beginning, but again, pretty new, a lot of information to take in. Each year we keep gaining and gaining. And so thankfully, NRCS is modifying our contract, so we'll actually get paid for the more of the permanent fencing than the temporary fencing. Again, my goal was to bring in money to cover our expenses. Hopefully we'll have enough that we can actually pay an intern this year. That's my goal, will be a part-time intern, and some of my expenses as well as the equipment. We've been able to easily cover the equipment with that equip contract, so that's not been a huge issue. But again, we have been incurring more fund or more expenses because of the more permanent nature of the fencing we are building. Spend a lot of time on that, so the more we can build it to be good fences instead of temporary fences, I'm finding that much more beneficial for us in the long run. A lot of time spent on fences. And then monitoring. This is key. Monitor, monitor, monitor. And I know I even heard that in the beginning. I was not taking as many photos as I would have liked from the same point. So this year we actually finally started doing some monitoring. So you can see some samples here, looking at the soil, digging down, looking at the root system, and capturing all these photos so we can now go forward and continually monitor the exact same places year after year, which is going to be a huge difference. But what I did, so that I did have something to capture, was from HMI, a safe to fail test, where we fenced in a small area. This was about 40 by 40, and we ran cattle for 3.5 hours and about 25 head. And the idea would ultimately have been shoulder to shoulder for that entire time. But we had a much larger facility, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I show you these pictures. But the idea is they break up that soil, they add their urine and dung, and then they also what's called litter is coverage. So if there was bare ground and we have tall grass, as you can see some of that, and they push that down onto the ground, we're now covering that bare ground. And that helps with the whole ecological process in terms of we've got the temperature now at a more ambient temperature, if you will, or cooler temperature, but now more nutrients are going to survive in that bare ground area because we've got that litter coverage. And so this demonstrates exactly all of those things that the cattle are able to do. And again, this is in 3.5 hours. This is another picture of it, of our test area. And then this is in 2022. We actually started this in 2021. So inside the fence is the test area, and outside the ground was exactly, the grasses looked identical before we put up the fence in the test area. And so you can start to see it looks much more lush and definitely higher grass. And that was in 1 year. And then in 2023, you can see even more of an impact between the test area and outside. And one of the things that I learned is a simple test that they call a stack test. You take 10 steps, do a measurement, take another 10 steps, do it for 10 times. And so I continually did that, especially the first couple of years, and taking photos as well. So again, in July, our test area and the area outside the test area. And so these are photos of me looking down the test area, inside the test area, and outside the test area. So ideally doing this all around the property, we're now going to be able to do that with our monitoring. There's some photos I can go back and still capture some things, but definitely taking those photos, documenting and keeping track of all of it is critical. So then I wanted to do one other thing. So we ran the cattle in that test area in 2021. We hadn't gotten back to it just because of logistics. And so I decided this year in July, let's split that test area because it was definitely larger than it needed to be in half. So we actually put a fence, as you can see, right down the middle. So this was the test area, both sides of it. We ran the cattle through, and this is what it looked like after they ran through. This is the one half of the test area, and this is the other half of the test area. So they did their job, and then what the idea is just to rest the land and see what happens over time and never touch that part. It'll be harder to compare the inside and the outside, but we'll be able to still do it. And so we look at that holistic framework. Again, I'm not going to go through details. They have courses on this. We offer classes. There's a lot of classes that are being offered by it on it. But just some of the highlights. I mentioned the predator prey and the four key insights and ecosystem processes. But the tools, I mentioned the tool. There is a place for rest. There is a place for fire. But looking at things in a holistic and what your holistic context is and what is the best tool to use. Human creativity is always included because it's always being used. And it's probably one of the most underutilized tools that we consider. And then that feedback back loop of looking, monitoring, planning, controlling, replanning. And then they even include within the framework and all of the holistic management practices is a decision-making process, which really helps, weigh if you have two different things or just one, is this the right thing to be doing? Along with the financial planning, and there's so much involved in this, but it's manageable and it allows us to manage the complexity, both or all three, ecologically, financially, and socially. I mentioned the workshops we do offer. One of the students in our first year, which was in 2022, so 2 years in, they had recently bought property. She came to the class, her and her family. She started employing the holistic management practices. And in 2 years, look at the difference between her land and her neighbors. And they had no precipitation that spring. So her land held that water, right? We can almost just deduce that just from these photos. And so powerful that just in 2 years, what she was able to do, similar to what we've been able to do at the land at Mother Cabrini Shrine. The other thing, resources. So last year, using, looking at our holistic context, all the things we wanted to do, I really wanted to bring volunteers out to the land so that we had help in doing what we were doing. We couldn't keep doing it on our own. And so we scheduled a day a month and we had volunteers come out, help build those new fence lines that I mentioned, that fourth one in the west side, and then the new one over on the east. It was so great just to see us get these things done with a team of people. We had some interesting weather one day, but everybody still loved being out there. And so in summary, holistic management is a decision-making framework for balancing that ecological, financial, and social needs of any complex system and creating that truly regenerative outcome that we all really desire. And so with that, our successes have been based on understanding the complex nature of things and using a system that helps with that complexity. The grasses have improved, the forage has improved. I say grasses, native grasses. Actually, it's been amazing to see the native grasses coming back. And so again, that animal impact sometimes just awakens that seed bed that's been dormant. And so we did not apply anything. We had no irrigation. So this was just using animals that we rotated throughout, did the planned rotational grazing with. The money, luckily, we've been very fortunate with the grants and the equip contract, so very excited about that. And each year we just keep improving, and I'm really excited about this coming year. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope that if you're not doing holistic management, that you start doing it. It's a great tool for all of us. Thank you.